My wife turned to me at the company party and said with a crooked, almost provocative smile, "I want to dance with my boss," and before I could understand the weight of those words, she already had her hand extended to him, heading towards the dance floor as if everything were normal, as if I weren't there. My feet froze to the ground, but it was my heart that really stopped. Not for the request itself, but for the tone, for the way her eyes shone at him, as if I had become invisible in that instant. And when she turned in his arms, her eyes fixed on his, I knew something very wrong was happening. The way she smiled at him, the way he freely pulled her by the waist, as if he had done this before. And then, in front of everyone, without any shame, she kissed him. A kiss full of desire, of certainty, of intimacy. I froze, not out of fear, but because I didn't know how to bear the pain that came like a sudden, silent stab. Everyone around me continued laughing, toasting, dancing, as if that moment hadn't ended my life. I took a deep breath, turned my back and walked away. When she arrived home hours later, the divorce letter was already on the table. It was just a sheet, but it weighed like a coffin. At that moment, I discovered what it was like to die while alive. Because it's not the kiss that destroys a man, it's the lie that comes before it, it's the complicit silence during dinners, the cell phones turned down, the looks that look away. It's knowing that everything you built alongside someone was being dismantled piece by piece while you smiled, while you trusted. I wondered how many times this had happened before and I just didn't realize it. How many parties like that had they danced together without my presence? How many hidden messages, how many excuses invented? It is at this moment that betrayal reveals its cruelest face, when it is not just an act, but a routine that you didn't know existed. And what hurt the most was the fact that I loved her. He loved as a man loves only once in his life. I admired her, respected her, was proud of everything she was. I never thought I would need to protect myself from it. She was my home, my certainty, and suddenly she became my abyss. And he was the kind of man who knew the power he had over others. Always smiling, always surrounded by attention, and I, an ordinary, dedicated man, never imagined that someone like him would be interested in someone like her. But there they were, in full celebration, making a spectacle of my pain. What she didn't know, however, was what I discovered weeks later. Because when the penny dropped and the dust of anger settled, I didn't just want to walk away, I wanted to understand. I wanted to know why she destroyed everything. It was on one of those sleepless nights that I decided to look deeper. I searched through messages, social networks, old emails. I asked questions of people who had no reason to lie. And what I found was something that not even she imagined: the boss for whom she destroyed our marriage was, himself, a master of deception. He was not just a seductive superior, he was an experienced manipulator, who used women as pawns in his power game. What she believed to be the beginning of a powerful romance, in fact, was just another conquest of his, another line on the list of victims. I was silent when I found out. Not out of weakness, but out of strategy. She still thought she had control of the situation, that she had beaten me, that she was experiencing something greater than our years of love. Little did she know what awaited her. I saw her fall, step by step, as he began to walk away. When the messages decreased, when the invitations stopped arriving, when "good morning" became just "hi." I saw in her eyes the confusion, the denial, the disappointment emerging. But the final blow would come later, with something I never imagined I would see, her discovering that he had been married for years, with children and a reputation as a womanizer that circulated through the company's offices, always hushed up by his influence. She confronted him, of course. And he was direct, cold. "You knew it was just for fun," he said, "you were never the exception." That's where the mask fell. The glow she carried since that kiss at the party was extinguished once and for all. She tried to look for me, explain to me, ask for forgiveness, say she regretted it. But it was already too late. Love, when betrayed like this, does not return. Because it's not just about infidelity, but about cruelty, about indifference to the other's pain. And what surprised me was not the betrayal, it was the coldness with which she dealt with herself. As if he could erase everything with an apology. While she wallowed in her own error, I rebuilt myself. Slowly, with pain, but also with dignity. I met people again, I rediscovered pleasures, I recovered my self-esteem. And it was precisely in this process that I met someone who saw me as I was, broken, yes, but honest, whole in my commitment. Someone who looked me in the eye and saw value where others only saw routine. But before reaching that peace, there was one last twist, something she could never have predicted. Something that involved not only her lover and his lie, but also a situation that would bring each person's true character to light. Because destiny never fails to return the weight of their choices to the traitor. And what happened next was so unexpected, so symbolic, that I knew, in that instant, that the universe had heard me. And it is exactly at this point that everything turns around. Because it wasn't just a fling, it wasn't just a kiss. It was an entire castle crumbling and, at the same time, a new garden blooming. But would you know how to recognize betrayal before she kisses you in public? What if the love of your life was just using you to cover up something much bigger? How far would you go for justice? And most importantly, what would you do if you had the chance to give back in a masterful way, without lifting a finger? The answer is where most stories end, in the silence after the pain. It is there that everything will be revealed. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal, on the contrary, we believe that infidelity it tears apart lives, destroys families and scars hearts forever. All stories told are fictitious, created to show the devastating impact of wrong choices and how the truth always comes out. Get ready, because what you're about to hear it will mess with your emotions. Take a deep breath. The story will begin. They were the kind of couple who, in the eyes of others, seemed to have conquered life. Alex and Laura met at work, when he was still a young rising financial analyst and she was a recent marketing graduate, full of ambition and creative ideas. They had, each in their own way, a discreet posture, but there was a silent strength in both of them that attracted attention. When they started going out, colleagues noticed the harmony in their looks, the restrained gestures and the spontaneous smiles that escaped even when they tried to hide it. It was a passion that turned into a partnership with natural speed, as if the universe already knew that they would be more than just lovers, they would be accomplices. They got married 3 years later and built a solid life, surrounded by plans, trips, dinners on Sundays, and a routine that, although predictable, was comfortable and safe. Their home was spacious, modern, a direct reflection of the achievements they achieved together. It wasn't luxurious to the point of seeming ostentatious, but it was elegant, with good taste, with books in the living room, scented candles in the corners and a balcony where they spent summer evenings drinking wine and remembering how it all began. Laura has always been detail-oriented. He had this way of putting a personal touch on everything, from the way he set the table to the notes left on the mirror in the morning. Alex, on the other hand, was methodical, but in a gentle way. He always arrived home from work at the same time, left his jacket in the same place, tried to find out how her day was, and made a point of preparing breakfast on Saturdays, even when he was exhausted. Despite their differences, there was a mutual admiration between them that seemed unshakable. He looked at her as if he was always rediscovering something in her. She listened to him with real attention, even on days when the topics were the same. In the eyes of their friends, they were the definition of stability and respect. They had that type of rare connection that wasn't shouted from the rooftops, but was seen in the silence between one touch and another, in the complicity of their gaze at family gatherings, in the details that only those who live together notice. There were many moments in which they both gave up their personal desires in the name of life together. Alex turned down job offers in other states to maintain his routine at home. Laura paused plans to do postgraduate studies abroad because he was going through a delicate phase in his job. And there were never any charges for it, at least not in words. The company where they worked together at the beginning was just the starting point. Laura ended up being promoted and transferred to a new headquarters, where she stood out for her emotional intelligence and her ability to deal with difficult people. Alex chose to follow a more technical, silent, but equally important trail. Over the years, the two built a solid network of friendships, attended company events, maintained the appearance of a well-established couple, envied by many. At dinners and get-togethers, she was always the most praised, for her charisma, her presence, the way she conducted conversations with ease, and he, with his air of restrained elegance, complimented everything with intelligence and education. Over time, Laura started to be invited to more strategic events, important presentations, meetings with senior executives. And with that, naturally, the figure of the new regional director also emerged, a charismatic and articulate leader who quickly became close to everyone, including her. Alex, with his reserved nature, did not view his wife's professional relationships with suspicion. He always believed that trust was the basis of everything. And until then, she had never given him any reason to think otherwise. In fact, it was this sense of trust that sustained the peace that existed between them even during periods of turbulence. There was a comforting routine to their lives. On Wednesdays, they ate pasta and watched old movies. On Sundays, she took the dog for a walk while he organized the house. They often planned small trips, weekend getaways to breathe away from the city. They talked about children, even though the topic was still left in the air, as a possibility that had no urgency. Alex liked watching Laura from afar, especially when she talked excitedly about her projects, her ideas for the company's campaign, and the compliments she had received. He felt genuine pride in his achievements. There was no competition between them, and he never had difficulty seeing her grow. On the contrary, he thrilled with each step taken. Laura, in turn, always described him as the pillar of her life. She said he was the calm in the midst of chaos, the kind of man who thought before acting, who didn't make empty promises. I took pleasure in pleasing him in small gestures, like choosing his favorite ties or preparing his favorite dish on difficult days. Sex between them, although it was no longer as frequent as in the beginning, was still marked by affection and dedication. It wasn't a relationship of explosion, but of depth. A connection that resisted time, responsibilities, and everyday distractions. The circle of friends they built was diverse. Some younger couples, others more experienced. Laura had friends with whom she shared confidences, and Alex was the type of man loved by everyone, always helpful, always present. They celebrated birthdays together, celebrated other people's victories with genuine happiness, lent shoulders and advice when needed. There were no visible cracks so far. Everything seemed in the right place. The company party that year would be bigger, a record expansion was celebrated, and the invitations had been delivered with pomp. Laura was excited about the event. She chose her dress in advance, booked a room, and took care of every detail with the attention of someone who knew this would be an important night. Alex, as always, was present, interested, praised her choices, and helped with the preparations. That week, he left work early to pick her up, made reservations at the restaurant where they would have dinner before the event, bought a small piece of jewelry to give her before the party, a silent, intimate gesture, like so many he had done over the years. On the way to the party, they talked about banalities. They laughed at inside jokes, remembered other get-togethers, commented on the names of colleagues who would probably be present. Nothing indicated that that night would be different. In the car, they held hands. At the entrance to the room, Alex noticed the eyes on her, as usual. She was the type of woman who effortlessly attracted attention. He, as always, felt proud. I was grateful for that story, for that love. The hall was lit, the music was lively, colleagues mingled in noisy groups. Laura was soon surrounded by acquaintances, exchanging greetings, smiles and toasts. Alex stayed close, chatting with other husbands, laughing with the waiters, soaking up the family atmosphere. It was an ordinary night, the kind that strengthens bonds, that celebrates achievements. Nothing that night gave any indication of what was to come. Nothing, absolutely nothing, seemed out of place. But like all stories marked by a turning point, something subtle had already begun to move there. An unusual gesture, a look that took too long, a brief and silent absence. It was as if, deep down, reality was waiting for the right moment to turn the key. But for now, on that seemingly perfect night, everything was still peaceful. Everything still felt like love. Alex walked among groups of colleagues as he watched, a short distance away, as Laura effortlessly glided through conversations and greetings. The music wasn't loud, but there was a continuous buzz that made each word spoken closer to the other's ear. The room glowed in the amber light of modern chandeliers, and laughter spread like fragments of an orchestrated spectacle. With every step, Alex saw familiar faces, handshakes, glasses raised, but his eyes always returned to her. Laura looked stunning, and that was nothing new. But there was something subtle about that night, a behavior that was difficult to define. The way she seemed constantly distracted, as if she was waiting for someone or something. As if time didn't pass at the same pace for her. He tried to shake off the discomfort that was beginning to arise. I knew that Laura stood out, that she was admired, even desired, but she always knew how to deal with that. There was never any room for gratuitous mistrust between them. Still, that night, there was a quiet unease taking shape. Laura laughed louder than usual, touched people's arms more often, looked around with a certain sparkle in her eyes that didn't just seem to come from the wine. And then he appeared. The regional director, the man Alex only knew by sight, greeted everyone with the confidence of someone who dominated the environment. When he approached Laura, she welcomed him with a hug that took longer than the others. It wasn't a scandalous gesture, nor was it provocative, but it didn't go unnoticed. There was intimacy there. A kind of silent language between two bodies that already knew each other beyond formality. Alex noticed, but silenced the perception. I wanted to believe it was just his mind creating ghosts. Throughout the night, they passed each other quick glances, some smiles exchanged. Laura seemed to levitate for a moment, then returned to the ground. They talked between groups, approaching and moving away, as if they were dancing a game that only they understood. Alex, although attentive, tried to maintain his composure, not allowing himself to be consumed by assumptions. But my stomach tightened, and my restlessness grew. He felt out of place, as if he were out of the rhythm of that party. He tried to talk to colleagues, he tried to laugh, but his attention always returned to the two of them. At one point, Laura returned with 2 glasses of wine and handed one to Alex with a smile that seemed practiced. She touched his hand for a second longer, looked into his eyes as if she wanted him not to suspect anything. But that gesture, previously so spontaneous, now seemed planned, strategic, as if it had the specific objective of diverting him from something. The music changed to something slower, danceable, and the dance floor was filling up with couples. Laura looked at Alex and said that she needed to greet some people in the sector and walked away with the same smile as always. He nodded, without question, but watched. The minutes dragged by as she crossed the room. Until he stopped next to him. The director. He greeted her again, this time with a more intimate, almost imperceptible gesture, a touch on the back that isn't used with just anyone. Then she said something that Alex couldn't hear, but his response came in the form of laughter and a wave towards the dance floor. Laura hesitated for a moment. Then he extended his hand. The two headed to the center of the room. There, in front of everyone, they began to dance. At first, as 2 colleagues celebrating a successful night. But the steps became closer, the gestures more intimate. Laura was smiling, with a sparkle in her eyes that Alex knew well, but that at that moment seemed to be offered to someone else. He instinctively approached the edge of the track, trying not to attract attention, trying to understand what his eyes were seeing. The distance between the 2 dancers decreased with each measure. The smiles were more frequent, the looks deeper. Laura tossed her hair to the side and placed her face against his in a natural way. Too natural. Then it happened. Fast, precise, painfully clear. A kiss. A kiss that could be explained, denied, disguised, but that Alex saw. And that was enough. Because it wasn't about the kiss. It was about everything leading up to that moment. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the end of something that had already been built in silence. The world around him continued to move, but for him everything stopped. He felt no immediate anger, no shame. He felt empty. A type of pain that does not explode, but corrodes. As if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He didn't confront. He didn't make a scene. He turned and crossed the room with firm steps and eyes fixed on the floor. He got in the car and drove aimlessly for a few minutes, until he parked in front of the house. He stood there, in the dark, with the steering wheel in his hands, trying to process it. The image of the two of them together, dancing, laughing, kissing, repeated itself like an infinite scene in his mind. When he finally got out of the car, he went up to his room and opened the drawer where he kept documents. There, among papers and contracts, was the draft of a letter that he had written some time ago, when he thought about surprising Laura on their wedding anniversary. He took that sheet, turned it over and wrote, without hesitation, a direct, cold, definitive divorce request. He left it on the living room table. Next to it, the alliance. In the early morning, she arrived. She opened the door with silent steps, expecting to find him sleeping. When he turned on the light and saw the paper on the table, he stopped. The heart raced. The silence in the house was almost oppressive. He read every word like someone reading a death sentence. There were no accusations, just one observation, the end. He walked through the rooms, looking for him, but Alex was no longer there. Neither physically nor emotionally. The night that began with music and smiles ended with deafening silence. The cell phone rang. It was a message from him, short, "It's done." She tried to respond, tried to explain, but there was nothing more to say. Betrayal, until then a hidden game between glances and hidden encounters, was now naked, exposed, irreversible. Laura sat on the sofa and cried silently. Not because of the immediate consequences, but because of the certainty that he had destroyed something that he could never rebuild again. But what she still didn't know was that the man she risked everything for kept a secret that would completely change the course of history. And this secret, about to be revealed, would not only affect your life, but it would transform your perception of everything you thought you knew. Because sometimes betrayal isn't the worst blow. The worst thing is finding out that you never knew who was by your side. The next day dawned dense. The sky was clear, but there was a strange tension in the air, as if the world knew of the collapse that had just occurred. Laura spent the morning trying to understand where she had gotten lost. He tried to rationalize his own steps, justify his impulses, build a logical line between desire and the destruction he caused. Nothing made sense now that emptiness had taken the place of adrenaline. That kiss, once a culmination of exciting transgression, was now just the spark of a fire that she couldn't put out. The divorce application paper was still on the table, now crumpled between his sweaty hands. He tried to call, he tried to write, but everything seemed useless given the lack of response. The house was silent, but inside the chaos was deafening. Alex didn't sleep. He drove for hours, aimlessly, parking on empty streets, stopping at gas stations, staring into space. The mind spun with sharp images. He felt like a stranger in his own life. The weight of the end crushed him in a controlled way. There were no screams, no fury, just a dry, constant pain that numbed him. When morning came, he decided he wouldn't run away anymore. He returned home not for reconciliation, but to face reality. He found Laura sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by photos of the two of them, memories ripped from their frames. She saw him and got up immediately, but stood a few steps away from him, not knowing if she could get closer. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, just looked at her as if trying to recognize her. She started talking, running over words, apologizing, crying between broken sentences, saying that she didn't know how it happened, that it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, that she loved him, that she still loved him. Alex waited for her to finish, and then responded in a firm and surprisingly calm voice. He said that he wasn't there to hear justifications, that she was free to do whatever she wanted, but that he was also free to no longer accept that presence at his side. Laura despaired. She tried to touch him, tried to revive any trace of what they were, but he pulled away. He said he needed to understand some things on his own, and that she needed to accept the consequences. Before leaving again, Alex looked deep into her eyes and said that nothing would be like before, because now he knew what she was capable of doing out of vanity. Not for love. Not out of necessity. But out of pure ego. The words hurt him as much as they hurt her, but they were too raw truths to ignore. That same afternoon, Laura received an informal call for a meeting at the board's office. The invitation came through a polite but direct message. Upon arriving, she was greeted by disconcerting looks, tense greetings and forced smiles. I knew something was wrong. She was taken to the room where the regional director, the one with whom she had exchanged the kiss the night before, was waiting for her. Sitting at the table, with a serious expression, he asked her to sit down. There wasn't the same charm, nor the usual seduction. The atmosphere was charged. She tried to break the mood with some question, but was interrupted by him, who began to speak in a formal, almost distant tone. He said he was very sorry about what happened, that the party had gotten out of control, that certain behaviors had crossed the professional line. Laura started to get confused. She didn't expect that. I thought that, despite the error, there was some real connection there, some meaningful exchange. But he continued. He explained that in recent days he had received alerts from the compliance team, that images of the party were circulating behind the scenes, and that their conduct could seriously compromise the company's reputation. Laura tried to argue, but he cut her off. He said that, in addition to the general discomfort generated by the exposure, there was something even more delicate. Something she needed to know. For a moment, everything was silent. The director took a deep breath, rested his elbows on the table and spoke with the coldness of someone who no longer cared about the consequences. He said he was married. Which it always was. He kept his personal life secret because he didn't trust corporate environments to reveal his weaknesses. He said that his wife, a well-known figure in legal circles, was already aware of what had happened and that the situation between them was now unsustainable. But the most surprising thing was not that. He revealed that his approach to Laura had been intentional at first. That she had been chosen. Laura froze. He explained that his wife was in the process of trying to get back together with him and, in recent months, had become suspicious of his fidelity. To prove something to her, he decided to play. Approach the most praised, most seen, most admired employee, and show that, if she wanted, she could win over anyone she wanted. He said the kiss at the party was the culmination of an emotional experiment. A blow of vanity, of a wounded ego, a rehearsed provocation. She, without knowing it, had just been the pawn used in his marital game. Laura, astonished, tried to laugh, tried to deny it, tried to understand if it was a joke. But he just lowered his eyes, as if he didn't even feel guilty. She said that she admired her competence, that she didn't want it to affect her career, but that perhaps it would be better for her to consider a transfer request or even a leave of absence. Laura felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The man for whom she had destroyed her marriage was not only married, but he had deliberately used her vulnerability for an internal theater of which she had never been informed. He left the room with his legs shaking. The humiliation was total. And it was only there, when crossing the corridor towards the elevator, that the tears came. It wasn't just the regret of betrayal. It was the pain of discovering that she was never truly wanted. That her downfall was engineered by someone who saw her only as an instrument. A pretty face, a seductive body, a chess piece. And worse, she had thrown away the love of a good man for this. When he arrived home, he found Alex in the garden. He looked at her without surprise. As if I already knew. She wanted to speak, wanted to run into his arms, beg for forgiveness. But he didn't move. He said just one sentence, simple but definitive. You destroyed everything for nothing. She fell to her knees, begged, explained every detail of what she discovered. He cried like someone drowning. But Alex didn't react. He heard everything in silence. In the end, he stood up and said that that pain was his now, and that he would no longer carry any of it. He grabbed his things and walked out the front door. And Laura stayed there, with the echo of her own choice reverberating inside her chest. No love, no career, no ground. Because sometimes, the true punishment for betrayal is not loss. It is the awareness that what was lost can never be replaced. That morning after the definitive collapse, Alex followed his path without a clear destination, but with a new lucidity in his eyes. For the first time in weeks, there was no confusion, just certainty. He drove to the nearest beach, one of those they usually visited when they needed to escape their routine. He parked the car, took off his shoes and walked on the cold sand still wet with dew. The sea was gray, calm, but his head finally found silence. He sat down and looked at the horizon as if searching for an answer that could not be said out loud. His marriage was over, yes, but what was eating at him now was the lack of genuine regret in Laura's eyes. The crying, the pleas for forgiveness, the emotional speeches, it all seemed more like despair over loss than true guilt. She regretted the outcome, not the path. And he couldn't forgive that. He spent the rest of the day there, writing in a small notebook he had in the glove compartment of his car. He wrote down thoughts, fragments of everything he experienced. For the first time, he organized his pain like someone packing a move. At the end of the afternoon, he called his sister, one of the few people he trusted completely, and asked to spend a few days at her house. The sister didn't ask any questions, she just replied, "Come, there's space and silence here." And that was enough. Alex gathered his few bags and left. He didn't leave a notice or write a note. I knew Laura would understand the message of her absence. It was time to move on. Meanwhile, Laura slowly sank into a colorless everyday life. The days passed with the weight of glances at work, of avoided messages, of doors that used to open easily and now required effort to even be noticed. He requested an indefinite leave of absence. He said he needed to take care of his emotional health, but what he really wanted was to escape the eyes that already knew. Inside the house, the silence was absolute. The echo of his own footsteps reminded him of what he had blurted out. I spent the nights reviewing photos, old letters, listening to audio files saved on my cell phone, happy voices from a time that seemed like another life. She tried to find solace in conversations with friends, but most of them discreetly walked away. No one knew what to say to those who destroy their own world with their own hands. As the weeks went by, he began writing long messages to Alex. I deleted them all. I turned on my cell phone, looked at his photo, blocked it. Unlocked. I tried to follow. But following without a direction is just wandering. She knew that now. He tried to fill his time with courses, activities, walks. But everything seemed mechanical. As if she were watching her own life from the outside. Until one rainy afternoon, she decided she needed to see him. It didn't matter how. I knew he had gone to his sister's house. He packed his bags like someone going on a mission and drove for hours. When he arrived, the sky was already dark and the smell of rain seemed to announce an uncomfortable reunion. Alex saw the car park and knew. He didn't need to see the face, nor hear the sound of the door slamming. It was as if the past had come knocking on the door before its time. He came out of the porch and found her at the gate, with her eyes swollen and her hands shaking. She only said her name. He didn't respond, just gestured for her not to enter. She stopped, took a deep breath and said she needed 5 minutes. Alex hesitated, but relented. They walked together to a nearby coffee shop, where they sat facing each other like two strangers carrying too many memories to fit between 2 cups. Laura started slowly, saying that she wasn't there to ask for forgiveness, because she knew that forgiveness was a road that might not even exist anymore. He said he just needed to tell the truth until the end. He said that he had redone every step, every decision, and that he now saw how foolish he was. That she thought she was being desired when, in fact, she was being used. She said she was not just deceived, she was manipulated. And that she wasn't trying to clean up her image, just share the burden with who, deep down, was still the only person who knew every version of her, even the one she despised herself. Alex listened to her in silence. He didn't interrupt. His eyes were empty but attentive. When she finished, he responded in a voice that was no longer the same. He said he understood the remorse, but that it didn't change the facts. That her feelings now no longer had a function. He said that she had not only betrayed her marriage, but destroyed everything that supported her trust in people. And that, even if he tried to rebuild something, it would no longer be with him. Because love, for him, had always been synonymous with security, with refuge, and she had turned all of that into a threat. Laura cried silently. He said he understood. That I wouldn't insist anymore. But she needed him to know that nothing they did together was a lie. And he, looking into her eyes for the last time, replied, "The problem is that when a truth mixes with a lie, it also dies a little." He got up, paid the bill, and left without looking back. In the days that followed, Alex found a discreet peace. It wasn't happiness, yet. But it was peaceful. He started running every morning, picked up old hobbies, and even signed up for a creative writing course. It was there that he met Sophia, a woman with low speech, an easy laugh and eyes that carried more stories than words. At first, they barely talked. But over time, they began to exchange opinions about books, films, the world. Sophia was discreet but intense. He made no promises, but he had a presence. And with it, Alex began to experience something he had forgotten, lightness. The meetings became frequent, spontaneous, and one day, without effort, he realized that he was laughing without guilt. It wasn't an escape, it wasn't a replacement. It was just someone arriving at the right time, without rushing. Sophia never asked about her past. She waited for him to want to tell her. And when he told her, she just held his hand and said, "Thank you for trusting." It was in this simplicity that Alex understood that starting over did not need to be a repetition of what was, but a reinvention of what one is. Laura, in turn, continued the slow process of reconstruction. She moved to a smaller apartment, started therapy, cut her hair and started working at an NGO that supports women in crisis. It was a way of giving something back to the world. Not because she thought it would redeem her, but because she now knew the value of care. He started carrying a notebook in his bag, where he wrote letters that he would never send. In one of them, he wrote, "The pain I caused was a reflection of a pain that I myself did not know how to carry. Now I carry the weight of having lost him by my choice. And that will be forever." Lives went on. Not parallel, not connected. They just followed. Years later, by chance or fate, Alex and Laura crossed paths in a bookstore. He has a book of poetry in his hands. She, leafing through a philosophy title. They exchanged a serene look, a restrained smile. Nothing else was needed. She whispered, "Are you okay?" He replied, "Very." And before any remnants of the past tried to resurface, she smiled and said, "I'm happy." He responded with a wave and left. It was an ordinary afternoon, but at that moment, it became clear to both of them that they had closed the last chapter of their story with dignity. Sometimes the end doesn't come with screams or slamming doors. It comes with the silence of an interrupted conversation, with the lack of response, with the certainty that you won't return to the same place after you learn to walk alone. And that's how it all ended, without going back, without resentment, but with the certainty that some loves, when betrayed, are not reborn. They just saw memory. The days that followed that fleeting reunion in the bookstore were different for both of them, although neither of them dared to share the impact of that moment with the other. For Alex, it had been like closing one last window that still creaked in the wind. Laura's vision, more mature, more contained, brought a memory of what they had experienced, but no longer aroused the desire to return, to rebuild. There was just recognition there, of what they were, what they lost, and, most importantly, what they would no longer be. That same night, lying next to Sophia, with her soft and calm breathing next to his, he felt a solid peace, as if he had finally stepped on solid ground after crossing a rough sea for too long. And it was in that comfortable silence that he understood what destiny had in store, not a noisy revenge, not an explicit reparation, but the gift of remaining intact, of not having become someone bitter, of not having returned pain with more pain. Laura, on the other hand, needed more time to process. She had rehearsed that reunion 1,000 times in her mind, devised unlikely scenarios where the conversation would last, where there was space to delicately revisit the past and, who knows, give the story a new twist. But it was enough to see him there, so serene, so complete, to understand that she had lost more than a love, she had lost the chance to be remembered with affection. The pain that came from this was no longer as desperate as before. It was a silent pain, which accompanied his cold mornings, his lonely coffees, his bus journeys looking out the window without a clear destination in mind. Time had transformed her, and in each transformation there was a little of its absence. The NGO where he started working became not only his job, but his emotional shelter. She immersed herself in the stories of the women she met there, many of them as torn as she herself. He felt that, by listening to those pains, he gave some meaning to his own. Helping someone start over made her feel less alone in her own rebuilding. And it was in this space of listening, of sharing, that he began to write more consistently. His texts were no longer unsent letters to Alex, but chronicles about choices, about losses, about the traps that are created when we confuse desire with affection. She published some texts on social networks, then on a blog, and little by little she began to be invited to lectures and conversation circles. Still, there was a dilemma that accompanied it: to what extent can you rebuild something on ruins that your own hand toppled? On the other side, Alex and Sophia consolidated a relationship based on trust. But it was not a construction without challenges. There were times when the ghosts would sneak up on us, looks avoided, answers too calculated, an uncomfortable silence after a poorly placed question. Alex was kind but sometimes overly cautious. Sophia, with her sensitivity almost too sharp, noticed when he backed away from something that reminded him of Laura. And he didn't demand it, but he didn't ignore it either. On one of those nights, after dinner with friends, she looked at him gently and asked if there was still somewhere inside him where Laura lived. He hesitated for a moment, then answered honestly. He said there was no more love, no longing, but yes, there were marks. And that the fear of being betrayed again was like a survival instinct that sometimes tightened your chest, even for no reason. Sophia just nodded. And he said he understood. That we all carry debris. The important thing was not to let them block the path. In this fragile balance, the two continued together. They built a routine that didn't imitate what he had before. There was more freedom, less rituals. More shared silence and less need to prove love all the time. And that freed him. He finally understood that it wasn't necessary to turn every relationship into a fortress against the past. It was possible to just be. Being. Feeling. Meanwhile, Laura faced a proposal that put her in front of a new dilemma. An editor from a small independent publishing house approached her after reading one of her chronicles. He proposed that she write a book about female experiences, choices and forgiveness. It was an opportunity to give new meaning to her trajectory, but it would also expose her. You would have to tell parts of your story. Make them accessible to those who didn't know them. Worse, maybe even to someone he knew. He hesitated for days. I didn't want to seem like someone seeking public redemption. But at the same time, I felt like there was something important there. Not to justify your mistakes, but to prevent others from making the same ones. He decided to accept, but with one condition: the book would not contain names, dates, or exact places. It would be about feelings, about human fragility. It wouldn't be about her, but through her. Writing the book became his new life project. And in the process, he faced his most painful memories with a courage he had never known before. Writing about betrayal wasn't the hardest part. The cruelest thing was writing about the beginning, about the good times, about everything that was real before it fell apart. Because therein lay the true tragedy: the fact that love existed, and yet it was not enough to avoid the end. A year has passed since that last look in the bookstore. Alex received a copy of the book in the mail. No sender, just a handwritten dedication, for those who taught me what it means to be whole and then showed me what it means to live broken. May life give you back in double everything you gave. He knew immediately. He wasn't surprised. He read the book in silence, in a few days, like someone traveling a familiar road, but in a different light. And when he finished, he didn't cry. He smiled serenely. He realized that he no longer needed to forget to move on. I just needed to understand. And there, in that last paragraph, he understood everything. He decided to keep the book on his shelf, among the novels that most impacted his life. Not out of attachment, but out of respect. For the story. For what they were. For the lesson. What neither he nor Laura knew yet was that destiny had one last deal in store. Not a return, not an apology, not a new meeting. But something that, once again, would put both of them in front of a reflection, and a choice. Because even when we think we've turned the page, life can come and force us to reread the most difficult passage all over again, in a new context, with a new lens. And it was this invisible curve in the road that approached. Quietly. No rush. As if destiny, patiently, was just waiting for the right moment to reveal its last card. The following spring, when the streets were already covered in flowers and the city seemed to breathe a silent freshness, an unexpected invitation arrived by email to Laura. It was from a university that promoted a cycle of debates on human relationships and emotional ethics. One of the professors had read her book, recommended it as mandatory reading in a psychology course, and now invited her to participate in a panel on regret and choices. She hesitated. Being in front of an academic audience talking about such intimate feelings required a level of courage she didn't yet know she possessed. But something inside her told her this was the moment. I no longer sought redemption or approval. He just wanted to remain consistent with the new life he chose to live, one in which he no longer hid from the truth. He responded positively to the invitation and, in the following days, prepared his speech with the calm of someone who finally knew what he had to say. The news spread through discreet circles, and without her knowing, Laura's name reached Sophia, who out of curiosity read some of her chronicles. Read the entire book in one night. She ended up teary-eyed, not because of personal identification, but because of understanding something profound about who Alex had been before being with her. He didn't feel jealous, nor angry. He felt respect. And the next morning, when I was preparing breakfast, I told him that I had read the book. Alex didn't show an immediate reaction. He just continued stirring the sugar in the glass and replied that he had already read it months before. Sophia asked why she never commented. He replied that he had decided to keep it as a gesture of respect for his own history. Sophia smiled and said she understood. And then, almost casually, he mentioned the event at the university. He said it might be a good idea to watch it. Not out of longing, but out of closure. Alex looked at her in surprise. He asked her if she really thought that was necessary. And she, with the delicacy of someone who doesn't force locked doors, just said that, sometimes, some goodbyes need to happen head-on. That night, Alex thought a lot. He looked at the papers on the table, the pictures on the wall, the messages on his cell phone. And he realized that, although he had rebuilt his life with dignity, there was still a part of him that had not been directly confronted. It was as if he had turned around the pain, bypassed the abyss with wisdom, but without ever looking into it again. He decided he would go. Not to talk, not to explain. Just to watch. To understand. Hearing her version of the story for the last time, told by herself, in front of strangers, without masks. On the day of the event, the auditorium was full. Students, teachers, curious people, readers. Laura arrived in advance, was received courteously and led to the stage. She wore simple clothes, hair tied up, almost no makeup. There was a serenity about her that wasn't forced, but wasn't comfortable either. I knew the weight of what I was going to say. When he entered, he didn't see Alex among the public. I didn't know he was there, in one of the last rows, sitting silently next to Sophia. The debate began with other guests talking about bad decisions, about remorse, about lost opportunities. When it was her turn, Laura took a deep breath and began. He said he wouldn't talk about betrayal in the ordinary sense. That his speech would not be a public mea culpa, nor a spectacle of pain. He said he wanted to talk about noise. About the sound that grows inside us when we lose the ability to hear others. When the ego screams louder than affection. He talked about how, for a long time, he confused admiration with desire, praise with validation. He said that his biggest failure was not the physical betrayal, but the previous silence, the small deviations, the avoided looks, the unshared fears. He said that loving someone requires courage that not everyone is willing to sustain. Because to truly love is to make yourself vulnerable, and she had failed at that. He ended his speech with a phrase that touched many there: "It wasn't the mistake that destroyed me. It was discovering that real love is rarer than I imagined. And that, once lost, it doesn't come back with flowers. It comes back with silence." At the end of the talk, timid applause filled the space. There was emotion in the air, but also a restrained respect. Laura thanked him and quickly left. Backstage, he drank a glass of water trying to catch his breath. It was then that, when he turned around, he found Alex. He was there, standing there, hands in his pockets, looking at her with a mix of nostalgia and clarity. The two looked at each other for seconds that seemed endless. They didn't say anything right away. They just recognized each other there, at that moment, as two survivors of the same storm. It was she who broke the silence. He said he didn't expect to see him there. He replied that he didn't expect to come either. But I needed to hear from her, live, what I had previously only known from the pages of a book. She asked if he regretted coming. And he said no. That, in a way, that was the last missing piece. She smiled sadly. He said he had nothing more to ask for. Not to say that she was happy for him. Who knew he had followed? He nodded. He said she also seemed more at peace. And the two of them stood there, standing in front of each other, as if they were finally ending a conversation that started years ago. When they said goodbye, it was with a long hug. No desire, no heartache. Just two bodies that, one day, went home to each other. Alex returned to Sophia that night with a new silence. She was waiting for him with hot tea and a blanket on the sofa. He sat next to her and said he needed time to digest everything. Sophia understood. He didn't ask, he didn't pressure. She just held his hand and stayed there, beside him, waiting for time to do its work. In the following months, everything subtly changed. Laura continued to write, was invited to more events, and published a collection of texts about identity and choices. She moved to another neighborhood, smaller, more wooded, where she could walk alone and watch life go by with a certain peaceful detachment. Alex and Sophia decided to travel. They spent weeks away from everything, discovering new places, new memories, new bonds. The trip strengthened what was already strong, the notion that loving someone is not about erasing the past, but creating a space where it does not haunt the present. One day, many months later, while organizing his old books, Alex found the notebook where he wrote after leaving home on the day of the party. He read a few pages and realized how he had grown. How the words there were painful, but necessary. He took the notebook, leafed through a few more notes and then closed it. Not angry. With gratitude. Because it was that broken man who had taken him there, in one piece. And it was in this state of mind that, without knowing it, both walked towards the most surprising outcome, not the one that life writes with reunions, but with understanding. Because some stories don't need to be repeated to be eternal. They just need to be understood. And they both finally understood. Time passed as it usually passes for those who decide to move forward, not in a hurry, but with purpose. It doesn't heal completely, but it teaches you how to carry it. Alex found in Sophia not a replacement, but a new way of breathing. Their relationship, built on the rubble of deep pain, evolved with the respect of someone who understands that someone's soul is not empty, but full of traces, ghosts and echoes. Years later, on a cloudy winter afternoon, he asked her to marry him. There was no kneeling, no audience. It was in the middle of the room, while the two were folding clothes fresh off the line and laughing at a forgotten joke. Sophia looked at him with that look that always said more than any word and said yes, with a light kiss and a handshake that sealed more than a promise, it sealed the daily choice to stay. The wedding was intimate, surrounded only by those who truly knew what love meant after pain. Among the guests was Alex's sister, who held back crying during the ceremony and, afterwards, hugged him with a pride that needed no explanation. That day, there was no room for bitter memories. The past has not disappeared, but it has learned its place, a drawer locked with a key, which only opens when the present is strong enough to not fear it. Alex exchanged vows without thinking about Laura's voice, without the weight of what she represented. And when he placed the ring on Sophia's finger, he knew he had found not just a new story, but a new version of himself. A lighter, truer version. On the other side of life, Laura finally published her second book. More mature, more polished, denser. He didn't talk about her, nor about him. It was a book about unexpected encounters and the irreversible paths that certain decisions take. The criticism was generous. He received invitations for interviews, radio programs, and even collaborations with screenwriters. But the majority refused. I knew there was a limit between exposure and expression. And he didn't want to turn his pain into a spectacle. He helped women in silence, with precise words and discreet hugs. He built a real support network, away from social media, away from the cameras. It became, without realizing it, a reference. And, ironically, she started to be heard by women who, like her, one day lost their way thinking they were freeing themselves. Despite his new life, he still remembered Alex. Not with hope, nor with romantic longing. But with that kind of bitter gratitude you feel for someone you hurt and who, even so, was essential for you to transform. He never saw him again, nor did he try. He respected the silence between them as a last form of care. He knew that any attempt at reappearance would be selfish, a gesture from someone who had not learned to accept the consequences of their own choices. And she had learned. The most painful lesson, but also the most liberating, was understanding that not every mistake can be fixed. Some can only be understood. Years later, Laura met someone. An editor, widower, with 2 grown-up children and a sense of humor that disarmed even the grayest days. They started with casual coffees after work meetings and ended up sharing books, recipes, lazy Sundays. She didn't tell her story right away. She waited for the right moment, and when she finally revealed it, the man just looked at her tenderly and said, "We all have our chapters that we'd rather not reread. The important thing is what we write after them." And it was with him that Laura learned that life can, indeed, offer second chances. But not to relive what was, but to live what has not yet been discovered. The director, the one who initiated the collapse without ever assuming the consequences, had his own outcome. Years later, her behavior was reported by another employee, under similar circumstances. The evidence was overwhelming, the statements detailed, and this time the company couldn't turn a blind eye. He was terminated under allegations of inconsistent conduct. He tried to start over in another country, but his tarnished reputation preceded him. His fall was not thunderous, but it was continuous. No audience, no scandal, but definitive. He became someone who existed on the margins, moving between lost contacts and frustrated opportunities. Because life, when it demands, doesn't warn you. Just present the bill. Years later, during a lecture by Sophia on mental health and emotional reconstruction, Alex watched her from the back of the audience with the proud eyes of someone who recognizes in others a mirror of their own journey. In the end, when she talked about the power of reinventing yourself after great losses, he knew that, even without wanting to, the whole story had been necessary. The suffering of the past, although brutal, had been the bridge that brought him here. And at that moment, he understood that true love is not the one that arrives with promises, but the one that remains silent and builds, day after day, a safe place where it is possible to be whole. The story did not end with slammed doors, nor with dramatic reunions. It ended where true stories end, in peace after chaos, in light after collapse. Each one followed their own path, but everyone reached the end with the dignity of someone who faced their own flaws and chose to be better despite them. Because love, when betrayed, does not die. He transforms. Sometimes in anger, sometimes in longing, but when done well, it turns into learning. And there is no greater justice than living in peace after having known hell. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your comment, tell us your opinion and share with us your reflections on the choices, mistakes, and new beginnings that mark this narrative. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take this moment to subscribe, turn on notifications and not miss any of the next impactful stories we have here. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. The stories told here are fictional and aim to show the devastating consequences that infidelity can have on the lives of real people. Thank you for following this far. See you in the next story.